Bem-vindas, bem-vindos de novo. Bom dia, boa tarde. Acho que tem algumas pessoas que são quase boa noite já. O Allan e Sue, inclusive, que estão 5 horas para frente. Muito feliz da gente abrir esse espaço. Eu estava falando, a gente teve uma resposta muito grande de pessoas inscritas, o que nos deixou muito contentes e também curiosos, porque tem muita gente aqui que a gente conhece já das antigas, muita gente que a gente sabe que está envolvida nesses movimentos do ativismo delicado historicamente, e muita gente nova. Eu acho que esse nome do ativismo delicado, ele é um nome, no mínimo, curioso, e a gente vai, hoje, eu vou contar um pouquinho da história, né? Então, eu me apresentei, já vou me apresentar de novo, eu sou a Bia da Escola Schumacher Brasil, e a gente resolveu abrir esse espaço de conversa com o Allan e com a Sue, porque a gente estava em conversa com eles, a gente recebeu eles já no Brasil, eles vêm ao Brasil já há muitos anos, devem inclusive entender já um pouco mais de português do que a gente imagina, e tem uma relação de longa data e um trabalho muito extenso desenvolvido aqui no Brasil, com várias parcerias já muito sólidas há muito tempo. No ano passado, a gente, em parceria também com muitas dessas pessoas que habitam essa rede deles aqui no Brasil, a gente lançou aqui no Brasil, em primeira mão, o livro deles, O Ativismo Delicado, uma versão que foi reeditada. Então, também convido a quem não conheceu o trabalho, é uma boa forma de entrar. É um livro que foi publicado pela editora Bambual. E eles vêm muito ao Brasil já historicamente. O ano passado, a gente teve alguns encontros com eles organizados pela escola. E aí a gente, nessas trocas todas sobre o livro, a gente ficou pensando, assim, muito perguntando para eles como que o lugar de onde eles vêm influencia a prática deles. Até hoje, né? Influenciou e influencia até hoje. E aí a gente teve essa ideia de levar um grupo de brasileiros para a África do Sul. Então, é por isso que a gente está aqui hoje, abrindo também a possibilidade da gente ter essa conversa, não apenas com quem vai conseguir estar com a gente lá na África do Sul, mas porque a gente achou interessante, assim, eles vêm muito ao Brasil, mas a gente ficou muito curioso, assim, de tentar entender, porque eles vivem num lugar muito que e até hoje eu só vi fotos, eu não conheço, e num lugar muito bonito em termos de um bioma muito diferente, num lugar que fica a algumas horas de Cape Town e que se chama Towerland. E que eles moram já há muitos anos, tem toda a história do lugar, que eu acho que a gente não vai entrar em detalhes hoje. E o trabalho deles, que nasce muito do trabalho do legado do Goethe, do pensador e multi-artista, tem muito a ver com o entendimento, a compreensão da natureza e essa reaproximação humano e natureza. Então, a gente ficou se perguntando se a gente colocar uma lente e tentar entender um pouco do ativismo delicado pelo olhar especificamente da natureza. E é isso que a gente vai fazer aqui nesse tempo que a gente tem juntos, é focar um pouco a nossa conversa. Então, assim, o ativismo delicado, eu acho que é importante de dizer, é uma prática que não dá para ser explicada, eu diria. Então, até assim, esse formato também é um formato que eu sinto que eles topam, porque são muito parceiros, mas eu não acho que é a forma com que eles escolheriam falar sobre, porque viram falar sobre, e a prática é muito sobre conseguir, a partir de diversos convites, estar em contato com o que eles estão tentando cultivar. Mesmo assim, é sempre bom a gente poder conversar. Então, eu vou pedir agora, tendo feito as introduções, para que quem precisar da tradução, agora aperte o botão que deve já estar disponível, no botãozinho lá embaixo, onde está escrito mais, tem um botão com uma bolotinha, um globo, que está escrito interpretação. Então, se você quiser ouvir a conversa em português traduzida pela Fernanda, vocês agora selecionem esse botão e aí vocês vão ouvir ela falar em português. Se em qualquer momento vocês quiserem voltar a ouvir o inglês, é só vocês mudarem lá o que vocês selecionaram. Vamos fazer essa mudança, e aí se alguém por acaso tiver algum problema, levantem a mão aí, a gente vai ajudando, mas acho que tendo passado tantos anos de pós-pandemia, acho que todo mundo já se familiarizou com o uso do Zoom. Então, Fê, vamos começar? So I will switch now to English. And I'm just gonna check if it's all good for everyone. So if Great. I see some thumbs up. Welcome, Allan and Sue. It's really great to have you with us one more time. And I was very briefly telling everyone where the intention for this webinar came from. And I feel like tracing back, you have been to Brazil for many years now. And at the same time, I know that you have, from the stories I hear and from what I have, from what I know from the practice, you have been in a deep relationship with the land where you inhabit in South Africa. And one of the questions that we carry on this invitation of taking a group of Brazilians to Towerland is to be able to investigate how nature has influenced or influences into these days what you call delicate activism. So I was also telling them that this wouldn't probably be the format that you would choose, like talking about something, but that everything that you propose is usually much more experiential, and we would probably, if we could, all of us would be walking with you in Towerland and then having a conversation about what we have experienced. But I felt it would be a good chance also for those who know the practice to have the chance to have you answering some questions related specifically about how you see nature as part of delicate activism. So, yeah, so welcome again, and I will ask you some questions, and we will navigate and see where we get to. And I was, just before we open to everyone, just telling Allan and Sue that we had many people, much more people than we were expecting to join. And that I don't really know if these people have been in touch at all with delicate activism, if they know Allan and Sue from the past, if they've been to Towerland or any other courses run by Allan and Sue, if they've read the book or not. So I feel like a good place for us to start is and I know it's very difficult and it will be limited, but if you could speak just for those who have never heard about it and just read delicate activism, and they are here, they don't really know anything about the practice, how would you situate it for someone who doesn't have a clue about what we're talking about?
About delicate activism?
Yes. Basic one.
101. I think if I can start, if that's okay with you. I think that when we put the two words together, delicate activism, they might almost seem as though they are oppositional. And on the other hand, when we use the word delicate, we sometimes associate it, because this is its meaning, with being soft and gentle and tender and kind of loving. And in a way, when we talk about delicate activism, that's not the kind of delicate that we are referring to. Rather, that the delicacy is in our ability to really pay attention, to be present, to observe, to notice what's happening around us, to really build the faculties to work with our senses, to see what is really moving around us, and to become aware of the way in which our own assumptions or judgments or preconceptions often get in the way of our being able to accurately observe what's happening. And when we learn to be present, to be truly present, and to really pay attention, then we enter into the world in a very different way. And activism suggests an intervention, a doing something to try and change something, to make it better. And a delicate activism is predicated on the understanding that just by learning to pay attention, by learning to work with our senses and really notice what's happening around us, that is perhaps the most powerful intervention, because it guides then how we walk into the world and relate to it. And when you mention Towerland, Bia, we live in the most extraordinarily beautiful natural floral kingdom and wilderness. And so what we learn, and where nature becomes our teacher, is that we really are able to discover through nature, to really notice what is, not to try and make it better or to change it, to allow it to express itself. And in that way, through really observing and noticing the movements, the shifts, the changes over seasons, over years, over days, over time, we begin to understand that this natural world around us has its own life. And the more we pay attention to it, the more we understand it. So I think that's something of a kind of a beginning.
Sure. I would only add at this point that a delicate activism is a phenomenological practice, which means it takes very seriously that the way we see the world affects and creates the world that we see. So everything Sue's been talking about, how one enters the world, how one observes, is part of how we are different in the world, not by trying to change it, but by trying to see it in its own terms. And if we can see things in their own terms, then those things become enhanced with life. So in that sense, it's a phenomenological practice, and that also means it's very aware that it itself, the practice itself, the way we're seeing, is the change that we're looking for. It's we who have to build our capacity for presence rather than demanding that others do things differently. And if we can build that capacity for presence, the world around us begins to change. And I would only add at this stage to that it also is a practice that bases itself foundationally on living process. In other words, what we observe in the natural world, what we observe as life lives, that is how we try to work in the world and how we try to be in the world. So one could say that a not delicate activism might have as a priority that it must change the world. And the danger that I must change the world is that I can become precisely the same as the world that I'm trying to change. Because one way or another, everybody's trying to change the world. It's very difficult to find a way of being where people surrender themselves and accept the world and become present to it so that it may change through the very way that we see. Because there is a danger that amongst activists that we become as aggressive in our change efforts as the world that we're trying to have different.
Very good, basic one intro. And I know it's very difficult when we try, but there's something also about the process of trying to articulate that I feel can be quite enriching. And when I was hearing you speak, I was already making links on how one could say, well, yeah, nature would never do what we humans do in activism, or of thinking something and saying, okay, this person is doing something wrong, I need to shift how things are happening. But I don't feel like this is the way that nature influence. It's kind of an anthropomorphic way also of looking at nature and then doing this from to into how, okay, what can I learn from nature? And so if you could talk a little bit, or what you, as much as you can, about how then your relationship to nature overall, not only in Towerland, but in general, how that, because of course the work of Goethe comes also from being a scientist that was investigating nature, falling in love with it, investigating. And so, but then you come to the social realm, and there's a big shift on that, dealing with humans. But I know that nature has a big influence on what you have developed and called delicate activism. So could you speak a little bit about how nature has in the past, and in how you, I mean, kind of also moved a practice that was very inspired by something that happened in the biological world, in the world of nature, to then bring it to the human realm, and how you feel that nature, your relationship to nature, affects the practice? It's not an easy one, I think. It's very subtle.
Yeah, I think it is. And I'm going to start, but I want to start by saying, responding to what you said right at the beginning now, of how maybe it's helpful to articulate something which feels so huge and so comprehensive, I suppose, that every time we're asked to speak about delicate activism, it is that challenge. It never ceases to be a challenge, because it's not something that you have a fixed response to. There's no fixed answer to it. And perhaps this gives me a lead in that every context that we speak in is unique. And so however we respond will be in response to that particular context. So now we're responding to you, Bia, with your questions in this setting over here. And so one of the things that perhaps comes up for me very strongly is the whole question of context, that it's impossible to build a relationship with nature, with the natural world, with the living world, without taking context into consideration. Because everything that is here is in relationship to everything else that is here. There are no boundaries, there are no divisions, there are no separations. Everything is interwoven with everything else. And as we walk through the landscape, which is over 700 hectares, we see how the landscape changes all the time. But it's not a sudden, abrupt change that these 20 hectares are like this and the next 20 are different. The movement is almost imperceptible, but what grows on that side of the river facing the east, or that grows on the other side of the river facing south and higher up, is completely different, and everything has its own place. So understanding a plant without understanding it in its context gives us very little understanding. And it's the same in every social situation, that to be able to really enter into a social situation, we have to be able to pay attention to every detail, to the minutest detail, and to stretch ourselves more and more to be able to see more, because the more we see, the more we understand. And the more we understand, the more we see. So really extending our capacity to attend to the details, and then at the same time to look at what we are observing in its larger context, gives us a sense of the uniqueness of this particular person or organization or social situation. So do you want to take over?
So I would say that a delicate activism takes its foundations from nature, and this is what makes it a radical practice. And it's radical for me because in the social, I'm guessing that most people here are involved in the social realm more than the zoological or botanical or biological. Perhaps that's not entirely true, but going back to my own work in the social sphere, all these years of working in the social sphere, there's one word that is the most ubiquitous word. The word that is used most of all is the word change. We all talk about change. We're either trying to promote change or we're trying to retard change. But we're trying to work with change, and if we're organizational consultants, for example, we're trying to, or leaders, we're trying to promote change. Or we're trying to manage change or control change, because otherwise change gets out of hand and so on. What you learn from immersing yourself in nature is that change is the wrong word. Change makes us think there was one thing and now it's become another thing. And sometimes we don't want it to become that thing, so we intervene. And other times we do want it to become another thing, so we also intervene, but differently. But the idea is, can we manage the change? Can we promote the change and so on? In nature, change doesn't take place that way. I would even say that there's no such thing as change. But everything is in movement all the time. Everything is in a process of growing and a process of dying. All the time. Everything is becoming more of itself. It is a process. Nature is a process of becoming. Not even the word nature necessarily. Every organism is in a process of becoming more of itself. It's in a process of manifesting. It's in a process of incarnating. And as it does that, so it is always, as you were saying, I think, Sue, in movement. And you see the movement, but you don't see it because we see statically. We see a moment, like a camera. We don't often see a movement. So this idea that everything is in a place of movement, everything is in a place of metamorphosis, and a living organism has to be in movement if it is going to be able to remain itself and remain alive, because living is movement. That's something that we learned many years ago, but living on Towerland, it's like living inside of a miracle. Because when you look out at Towerland, everything, and realize with your imagination, because you can't always see it until you imagine, that everything you're seeing is in a process of movement, everything. This whole 700 hectares of nature is in a process of movement. That is astounding. It is miraculous. It gives one the feeling of being inside, of participating in something that is sacred, as life is sacred. So in that sense, I think my biggest learning from nature, from Thailand, is that when I walk into an organization, when I'm walking into a situation, as we're speaking to each other now, every one of us is moving. Every one of us is becoming something other now as we're speaking. And yet we have to hold also that we are all the same. We're all maintaining our identities. That's the feeling of, I don't know how to say, electricity that runs through the blood.
Yes, I think you spoke about imagination just now, and also this word change that is very present. And most of the way that organizations work is, even if it's not on like mainstream businesses, they are always wanting to act in the world in a way that starts with their heads and ideas, then they become strategies, then plans, and then it's executed. And so could you speak a little bit about how you perceive the difference of an intervention, an action that is based on what you said, this idea of change that comes mostly from our heads, to an intervention that is, like you said, is worried about first of seeing, of perceiving the movement and responding to it. And the imagination for me is something curious, because you mentioned the word, and one could argue that humans are very good in imagining and creating, you know, in their heads. And I think you're speaking about a very different kind of imagination. And how do you perceive the difference in an intervention that comes from wanting to change, with a plan already in our heads, and a participation that is first willing to see, to notice the movement that is invisible to us, and what does it mean then to respond from that space? And where does imagination then sit within that?
Mm-hmm. You. No, you go.
No, the thing that immediately arises for me is that we're all using our imagination all the time. So you mentioned, I don't know who it was, the leader of the organization or the CEO, whoever it is, who walks in and has a strategic planning session, or doesn't have a strategic planning session, but has got ideas as to what needs to happen, and then makes plans, and then you execute the plans and so on. It's a very, very rational approach to the world. But it doesn't lack imagination. There is imagination in that. And the imagination is that person or that organization or those people are seeing the world as, let's say, as a machine, as something that you can control, as something that you must control, and as something that you must organize into a set of linear actions which will have an outcome.
And managing becomes really important.
That's kind of rational, and we think, oh, that's not imaginative, but it is imaginative. It's a particular way of seeing the world. It's not seeing the world as a living organism. That's true. It's seeing it pretty much like a car, or a or a clockwork, or a clock. But it's still imagination. So the question is, we're always using our imagination, and we're always using our thinking. But how can we begin, as you said, Bia, to get inside, to work with the kind of observation that is so painstaking, that is so present, that as you observe and you put your imagination and your thinking on hold, and you observe and observe and observe, gradually through that observation, you can begin to enter into the life that is flowing through that organism, through that part, through that thing. And when you enter in, you begin to be able to pick up, well, where is this being? Where is this organism in its process of becoming? So a child is in a process of becoming and is not in the same place as they will be when they're adults, but they're still in a process of becoming.
As are adults.
As are adults. And so an organization is as well. There comes a time when the CEO or the founder has to leave because something's missing. And what is missing is not necessarily that this person has lost their skill or their ability, their inspiration for the job, but that the organism that they're leading has shifted and changed, and it needs a new way of working. Can we listen to where the organism actually is?
Yeah, and I would just add very briefly that from our Goethean practice, we see that there is a very, very important relationship between observation and thinking. And so when we go into an organization or work with a group of people, can we go in openly enough to really allow ourselves to observe without letting our own sense of what it should be or what it could be or what we like or what we don't like get in the way, and through that penetrated observation to begin to understand what is really going on. So the understanding is, I would say, an element of our imagination. We have to build an understanding by putting together everything that we have observed. And what we're really trying to build is an imagination which is faithful to observation rather than faithful to an analytical concept of what should or could be happening.
But I just want to add this idea that observation, real observation, is premised on a certain kind of thinking and a certain kind of imagination, which does not see itself as there observing in order to solve a problem, or in order to manipulate the thing it's observing, or in order to do anything with the thing it's observing. Real observation is there simply to try and understand. I say simply is the wrong word, but anyway, it's there to understand what is this organism, what is this part of nature doing? And suddenly when we observe in that way, we really do find ourselves in a different world. And it's a world that it's very hard to describe from the outside. It has to be experienced from the inside. That's why Goethe says we can become one with the object. We can, in fact, become one with the object.
Marieza, I saw that you've raised your hand. If you don't mind, can we leave it to the end of the session, then you come in? So can just...
Yes. Okay.
I was going to ask you, Allan and Sue, if you could speak, because I'm sitting here trying to think for those who are now in touch for the first time with the practice. When we hear the word observation or listening, it seems far away from the urge for action and, again, for change and for our participation in the world. Could you speak a little bit more about what does it mean to observe, which is not, because one can think that observation is just sit down and, contemplate passively and wait for something that is kind of now could be of the realm of miracle, perhaps. And I know that's not how you understand observation. So could you speak about a bit more of how you actually listen to a place, and especially if a place means also more than human and not only human, because I know your practice happens in the social realm, and I'm also thinking that the way that what I heard from you in terms of how you've been relating to Towerland and the land has been in a way a very responsive way of building the houses that you have there. So what does it mean to listen when also the listening is not only like a literal listening to someone speaking, but when the listening implies the wind, the sea, the land, the plants, the fungi? Not in a mystical way. It can also be how people hear this.
Yeah, not mystically speaking. I'm very glad you brought in the word passive, Bia, to really help to clarify that the kind of observation that we're talking about is not passive at all. It's really active. I think that perhaps there is nothing more challenging for us in the world, and I think it becomes more and more challenging to be really present to the world around us, to not be walking around with our head filled with what happened yesterday and what's going to happen tomorrow and what you think about this person and what's happening over there and plans and processing, but just to simply be awake to our context in every moment. And that building that muscle for observing is an incredibly challenging thing because we are accustomed to living in our heads and in a way disconnected from our bodies. So when we begin to extend our senses and really notice with our eyes, with our ears, the listening, with our sense of touch, the texture of what's around us, we begin to build a very, very different understanding than if we go into that situation just thinking about it in terms of all the constructs that live inside of us. And I was just thinking, as an example, what happens to you when you're sharing something? I don't mean you, Bia, I mean anybody and everybody. When you're sharing something of yourself with somebody that's really tender and deep and powerful, and you are really witnessed and heard by that person perhaps doesn't even have to say anything, but perhaps they do say something in response, which really gives you that sense of having been heard at the deepest level. That enables such a deep process of transformation for the person being listened to. But it's also for the person who's listening, because through attending to and being present to that person and entering into their space, something profound shifts for them also. So it's something about that. It's about being very active in the world, but active in an open, receptive way.
Two things. To observe, really observe actively, like Sue is talking about, is, well, it's active rather than passive, but it's a huge, huge work at the same time. You really have to dedicate and commit yourself to truly observing if we're talking about the observation we're talking about.
It's an unlearning process.
It's an unlearning process. I have had many experiences of working in organizations as a consultant, interviewing people, trying to understand what's actually going on in this organization. And people have come to the place where they tell me secrets that the organization is not talking about, secrets that the organization hasn't told itself. They tell me some of those secrets, not in confidence. I mean, obviously it is in confidence, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is that they're telling me things that they themselves have never thought of. They've never seen these things in the organization because no one's ever listened to them before. So the way we listen and the way we observe really does open things up around us. And one of the things I was going to say is that the kind of observation we're talking about is not it's an opening up observation. It's opening oneself up so that the other, whether it is mineral or animal or vegetable or human, can come into us.
Can enter in, yeah.
Can enter in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one thing. But just about Towerland, just to say quickly that Towerland is this land here, and it also has a context. And the context is that it does, quite a long way away, have other lands that surround it. And we have walked to the end of this land. Well, it's got ends in many places, but we have walked to one of the ends of this land and stood at a gate, at a fence, and looked over into the neighbor's land, which is not farmland, it's not farmed land, it's neglected land. And the difference between Towerland and the land next door, separated by a fence that is just an animal fence with a few strands of wire, is inconceivable. Because of the amount of attention that we have paid to Towerland, and because people who come here, the practice that they're doing when they come here is to be inside of the space and appreciating it and observing it. It does something to the land, and you can palpably see the difference.
Yes, I'm thinking about how to ask this question, the next question that I feel would be nice to explore, but in a way that doesn't feel instrumental, because I feel a lot of the way that people have been also learning with nature can be quite instrumental in also just reinforcing and the way things currently work. But I also wanted to, and I don't know if you could speak about that, but I'll try anyway. So like thinking about nature and the fact that you've been inhabiting this land and that I see how you in general relate to nature. What would you say, if you could say that what are the gestures or the patterns, the cycles, what has it created in you, witnessing these cycles over and over in Towerland, in a particular land, very deeply? What have these gestures and cycles, what do they teach you in general? Is it, but again, like it's difficult because like teaching, I think it's a bit extracting and applying. So I don't know, but I know, you know what I mean, I think.
What does, you have to ask it again.
If there's anything that in your relationship with the land throughout all of these years that you feel that it inspires maybe or teaches you about delicate activism, if something on the way that nature behaves, its gestures, its cycles, its gestures, how do you see that influencing the work of delicate activism?
When a flower opens, it opens. Every moment that a flower is opening and growing and allowing the flower's organs to emerge, at every moment there is something dying, there's something decaying. For the petals to open, the opening of the petals is a process of opening, but it's also a process of getting older and falling off at the same time.
When you started, it immediately triggered another thought for me, which is that there's some plants or flowers, let's say, on Towerland that take maybe about 4 months for their process of budding and opening and fully decaying. Could even be more than 4 months. There are other flowers that last for a day. And there are some flowers that last for a few days and some for maybe a few hours. There are such clear rhythms that are happening in this world. And each plant has its own rhythm, has its own cycle. And there's no way that we can apply any rules from one plant to another other than to get connected with the rhythm of each plant and how that connects with everything else around it. And something about trusting that you can't speed things up, you can't slow things down. Actually, everything will take the time that it takes in its own rhythm is an incredible, incredible teaching and learning. I don't know if that responds to your question, Bia, but it's what comes up for me. Yeah.
And that life is wanting to burst through all the time. When you think life is over, it comes through again, and it comes through again, and you see it in the material world around you, but you know that it is actually activating that material world.
Yeah.
I want to say one other thing, if I may quickly, and that is that we know that, how can I say this? Everything's happening as it should be happening. Everything's happening at the same time. There isn't somebody out, there's no CEO out there. There's no, and if there's a bee colony, there's no CEO of the bee colony. There's no CEO of the termite mound. Nobody is deciding to send two raptors, two birds who are nesting to the trees near where we're living now, who have never nested here before. No one's deciding to do that. And yet something is holding Towerland in the most incredibly creative order all the time.
Yeah, and I feel the image that you brought at the beginning of the answer of the flower that is simultaneously opening up and also, so in a way you could say growing, but also decaying at its, you know, most beautiful moment of life, and then starting to, that happens simultaneously. I feel that in itself is probably perhaps one of the biggest insights we could have, that all of these processes are happening simultaneously. There's no, okay, now we're going to grow and now we're going to die. And I think, yeah, that in itself, in a world that is obsessed with growth, that is a big lesson. I know we're getting to the end and I want to open for perhaps one or two questions, but before that, just a final question from me, and then maybe Marieza, who raised her hand, and then someone else. I'm thinking that what I feel with your work is I feel something that I feel sometimes when I'm in a retreat, in the sense that there's a relaxation and a sense of groundness and presence that I only sense when I'm in, you know, in a temple with people meditating. And there's something of this quality that I feel you bring quite strongly, at the same time that I feel I am in this state, but also constantly being dislocated and challenged in my thinking, observing, and the way that I'm even in what I can perceive from any experiences that I'm having with you. And I'm wondering if you could speak. So I'm very curious to go to Towerland myself, because I feel you kind of bring that through your presence very strongly, but I feel, of course, it would be completely different to be where you have such a deep relationship with. But I was wondering if you could speak about how you've been receiving and hosting people for many years now in Towerland. And is there anything you would say about you know, what happens in this transformation that you have observed during the years, that I feel like, if I could guess, I would say it's this mix of this capacity to ground and to be present, whilst also, but there's probably something you have experienced that you would like to share about yeah, about this silent transformation, and maybe not so silent when people visit you and have an experience with you. That is not that they're a retreat, or it's not, and it's at the same time not they're going to leave with you know, the 10 next steps to do whatever they want to do in the world.
Are you talking about the transformation for the people who come?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel so tempted to ask the two people that I know who are here, who have come to Thailand, to respond to this rather than for us to respond to it, because it feels difficult to respond to that question. But what you said here gave me a little bit of a clue, I think, to put it very, very simply. And that is that I think that being immersed in this wilderness, in this nature that has been not managed, but very, very deeply loved and cared for, provides something that is very, very grounding for people, that they kind of land and find themselves and feel themselves in a very deep and strong way. And at the same time, it kind of lifts them and opens them up, because they are experiencing elements of life and the natural world that they have never experienced before through the practices that we engage with. So it's a kind of a polarity of gravity, of being grounded and really feeling centered and finding your place on the earth, and being lifted up with levity to new realms of understanding. And that's perhaps part of the dislocation, is that it's a stretching practice.
Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of time, and I would like to give one or two people the chance to also ask questions. So Marieza, maybe we start with you, and if you could just briefly ask your question. I don't know if you want to speak in English or Portuguese. If English, in Portuguese, I can help translating.
I will speak in Portuguese because é sobre o estado de observar, que é um estado de silêncio, e aonde entra a imaginação, se a imaginação é um elo entre o estar presente e o contexto, ou se a imaginação é uma outra prática dentro desse contexto. A origem da imaginação, entre outras coisas.
Ótimo. The state of observing and the role of silence also within observing. And then she's thinking about imagination, and she's trying to understand if imagination sits between presence and context.
And if it's your elo.
And if it's the actual link between presence and context, or if not, what is imagination? É isso, beleza?
Yes.
I wouldn't say that imagination is the link between presence and context. I'm not sure that I could think about a link between presence and context. I'm not sure what it means to link between presence and context. But at the same time, then I don't want to be put into the situation where we now have to describe what imagination is, because... But?
No, sorry.
Everything that we see around us, everything that is organic, like here on Towerland, all of the plants, let's say, and everything that is a building, or everything that is a candle holder, everything comes out of ideas.
Yes.
Some of those ideas are human ideas. We think, oh, we need light, so we make a candle and we make a candle holder. That's a human idea. Some of these things, like the plants, are not human ideas because we can't control we don't create those plants. But everything comes out of ideas. It's the expression of an idea.
Okay.
That's imagination.
Okay.
What
Thank you.
expresses that idea?
Thank you.
Anyone else who would like to ask a question? Well, I do have more questions if no one else has. Okay, Heidi and Leticia. Okay, now two. Maybe we can try both and see. Let's, yeah.
Can you please give an example of a practice? Something you do in Towerland? Just something very simple, maybe. I'm curious.
Okay, here are two very, very simple things. The one is to go for a walk with a group in silence, not talking, but actually just allowing the land around, the world around, the birds, whatever, to be our main focus. So we're not chattering to other people, we're walking in silence and noticing what we're noticing around us, paying attention, and also paying attention to what's happening inside of us. How are we feeling? What's happening to us? That's a very, very simple example. Another one is from a play. There's several spots on Towerland where you can sit and look at cultivated land, the farmlands around us, because we're surrounded by farmlands, and you can feel and observe the wilderness around you also, and to move between these two and to notice the differences between them, what you are observing about them. But that's two very, very tiny little examples. We do lots and lots of observation exercises, lots of biographical exercises, lots of thinking exercises.
Yeah, very good that you asked this question, because I feel sometimes it helps for us to imagine as well what it could be. There's a question here. Go ahead.
You can also choose to do some exercises, like you can walk to your room without a torch, but with a candle, and see what the difference is when you have a focused light like a torch and what a candle does to the night. But you can choose.
There's one final question here from Jani, and I was going to plug a final ask for you, and maybe I'll ask her question and plug what I wanted to ask you. So she's saying one question. So is it just, I think, with observing and trusting life? So is it about voluntary simplicity in action? In other words. And then I was going to ask if you could speak. I mean, your practice can sometimes arrive very distant from the urgency, for some people, from the urgency that we live in terms of just doing the work. And a lot of people that I know who are doing work in social ecological causes are having burnouts. So what would you say to us? I'm going to say us, implying everyone. And I have you as very dear friends and mentors, so people who I feel very inspired and that touch me a lot when I have the chance to engage with you. So I'm wondering if you have a final word of perhaps of hope to us at this stage, and feel free then to also add to try to answer Jenny's question about observing and trusting life.
Hugo.
The question was about, there was a
Just
phrase.
say, is it just observing and trusting life? And the other way she has framed, is it about voluntary simplicity in action?
Voluntary simplicity in action. Well, it must be voluntary.
Can I just, 1 second, Alan, I just heard that the translation is not working. Is it, I think Louise is doing the translation now. So you should be able to, let's see. Is it working? Lu, fala alguma coisa. Say something. Yes? It's not working.
That's okay.
Okay, we can do it live now without the translation. You can speak and then we can translate back. I'm not a good translator, so I will excuse already, but I'll do my best. Okay.
No, I'm just thinking of the phrase simplicity in action. We are all faced with the most complex set of circumstances that anybody's ever had the problem of imagining.
A gente vive num contexto mais complexo possível de circunstâncias que alguém poderia imaginar hoje. Sorry, Alan.
Faced with a very, very complex world situation.
É um mundo extremamente complexo que a gente está.
To facilitate a conversation between people these days, just to facilitate a conversation, I wouldn't call that simplicity in action.
Então, facilitar uma conversa entre duas pessoas eu não chamaria de simplicidade em ação.
It might seem like simplicity in action, but there's nothing harder to do at the moment.
Pode parecer simplicidade, mas não tem nada mais difícil no momento de ser feito.
So I'm not sure. We learn all of that we learn from nature, from living process, but to work like nature is not simple.
Então, a gente aprende muito com a natureza, com os processos vivos, mas agir como a natureza é extremamente difícil.
We're not advocating a withdrawal from anything.
A gente não está advocando para que sair de algo, or what? The last withdrawing?
From anything.
De sair de nada. A gente não está advocando a favor de sairmos de nada.
We're talking about being present to everything.
Estamos falando de estar presente, realmente presentes para tudo. And that's not an easy task. Não é uma tarefa fácil.
No. In South Africa, we would say it's hectic.
Na África do Sul, eles falariam não é ético no sentido, hectic, é doido, é confuso, não sei se é essa tradução, difícil.
Frenético.
Frenético, boa, isso, hectic, frenético. Well, eu vou falar então meio português, meio tradução Herbert Richards. Agradecer todo mundo por estar presente e acho que por sustentar esses espaços que para mim são muito fundamentais da gente conseguir, então, de abrir esse espaço na agenda no meio de um dia cheio. Agradecer vocês por fazer isso e dizer que amanhã a gente vai ter nesse mesmo horário 1 hora para a gente conversar, fazer sentido de tudo isso e como uma prática também que para a gente é muito fundamental na Escola Schumacher, da gente poder não só receber os ensinamentos de quem a gente admira, mas poder entender como que isso chega em nós. Então, um pouco do que eles falaram que eles fazem lá em Towerland, a gente entender, tá bom, como é que isso chega em mim, como é que eu faço sentido disso no meu contexto pessoal, o que eu faço com isso a partir de agora. Então, venham, e se tiverem também mais perguntas sobre a imersão, enfim, sobre outros processos com eles também, é isso aí. Eu vou agradecer só eles em inglês. Alan and Sue, thank you so much one more time for being with us, and I'm really looking forward to continue this collaboration, and I'm so glad that you first arrived in Brazil 20 or so years ago, and that we have this close bond between our Global South mates. Então, que bom que a gente tem esses amigos do Sul Global também, e que vêm ao Brasil já há tantos anos. A gente vai mandar a gravação para todo mundo também, se vocês quiserem reassistir. É sempre bom. Muito obrigada, um ótimo dia e nos vemos amanhã.
Thank you, Bia, and everybody for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, muito obrigada. a todo
Obrigado,
mundo.
Bia.